expanding. So the African American experience and the African experience basically also means expanding into other cultures, such as a long-standing alliance with Asia, China, India. So Lao Tzu, author of the Tao Te Ching, his pupil Li Tiguai, Indus Valley in India, statue of the Buddha in Cambodia and Vietnam, Queen Nzinga, a warrior queen, Moorish nobleman. This is during the Moorish conquest of Spain, so Iberian Peninsula, 12th century, 13th century. Moorish noblemen playing chess, except they don't call it chess, they call it shatranj. I didn't show you this. This is more or less new, but this comes from J.A. Rogers. What this is Afro-European coats of arms from France, Italy, Germany, and Switzerland. So, for example, Morin, Morien, Moreau, Morin, Morier, Mohnberg, Morimont, Morin. So, in their names, Moor meaning black, Moringer, Moritzi, Morlo, and then when you start getting into the German-speaking countries, where switches from the Latin Moor to the German, which means black, the German Schwarzmann, Schwarzkopf. I have the originals. This is a bad copy that I digitized, so have to get the book at some point. But it's in J. Rogers, Sex and Race. A little bigger, but sometimes not as clear in the text, except when you see it in the original. So Afro-Europeans, who are existing alongside the Europeans as free citizens, but not always necessarily treated the same way, as we saw with Solomon Ibrahim Ganabal, and of course Ludwig, his teacher Haydn, Charlotte, her true mulatto face, according to her the royal physician, and her children, and the biographer that referred to as the monkey-faced little princess, or the queen that had simian features. Black Madonna in Spain, where the monks say, oh, the reason her face is black is not because she's black, it's because the candles and the soot, centuries of candles and soot have darkened her face. Yeah, okay. So, African and American. African self, so this is also final prep, so you get this in case you didn't get that on that question. This is Naim Akbar's African Psychology, where he's saying the African self as an individual has a soul, a body. The soul inhabits a body. The soul also vivifies the mind, and that's what you have as your personal expression. Then you also have a social, relational self and a tribal ancestral self. So soul spiritual, body physical, mind personal, social relational, tribal ancestral. So that's the correct answer, not my poem about soul-oriented times 5. Thanks for the props, but it's not the answer I was looking for. So one of the reasons I do this is not, I have to give tests. There has to be some way of evaluating. But I want you to reinforce learning this stuff. As with my addictions classes, where it's more clear that within the addictions context, if students don't learn this stuff, they die. I've seen that happen. This is not as life or death for you, largely. But it's important to know that when oppressed people survive, and if you are subject to that same oppression, it might be useful for you to be able to replicate that same success and adopt those worldviews. Just saying. So, Lucia, part of the American experience, the Olmecs in Mexico, General Harriet Tubman, Lawrence de Graaf, pirate, former Dutch citizen, part of the American experience, the Maroon experience. This is the Maroons negotiating a peace treaty with the British after defeating the British in Jamaica. This is General Nanny's maroon camouflage, if you remember that story, where this appears to be a banana bush, as does this one, as does this one, as does this one. Yeah, there's 3 in a row there. So 3 maroon leaders. And from the White House, this picture was taken in the, I believe, 80s, late 80s. So Njuka Maroons from Dutch Suriname, Seminoles from Florida, and Jamaica Maroons. Then also the experience of slavery being transported from Africa. So what's being reconstructed? So to add to the African experience in Africa and America, add Christianity and Islam as well as animist religions who preyed upon their neighbors and sold them into slavery. That's part of our experience. Ship them to America where they're stripped of their literacy, numeracy, all languages, religions, the egalitarian social systems, constrain their human rights, and then free them, quote unquote. So, what are they to reconstruct? So what you're going to have to reconstruct is going to be a reduced form of what you knew and created in Africa, which will begin to disappear the more the generations that remember Africa disappear. So then all you have is the American model, and then the American model of whatever the Americans decide to tell you, which, as you experience in your high school, is slavery and Martin Luther King. Not mathematics, not psychology, not economics, not kawaida, none of that stuff. Right, so what will they be allowed to reconstruct? So looking at, this particular graphic, which is from the museum in New York, kind of area expansive. It kind of, this is basically below decks in a slave ship. Regions of Africa most affected by the slave trade, which is mostly west and some central. Not all of it's represented on this map, but the major areas are Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, and also what's not really pictured in this particular graphic is Mozambique. and Madagascar. But so regions in terms of percentages, largest percentage being from West Central Africa, Congo, what's now Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola, followed by Benin, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. So there were about 173 African kingdoms and city-states affected by slavery. Now, within this reference, this article in Wikipedia, there's the bias that I partially share, but I'm just putting it out that it's a bias. I'm a city person, right? So they're defining city-states as being able to project military force and mess with their neighbors, which I don't think is very neighborly, but okay, if that's what you're going to use as a definition, all right. So out of this 173 number, they're talking on the close order of 68 or 70 that are city-states in that sense. So the low count, so many African-American scholars, kind of dispute this figure, but let's use it as a low number. So let's say that 12 million Africans were shipped to the Americas. So up to another 10 to 12 million were killed in the process of being captured or died in the process, either on ships or soon after they arrived. Because the article basically said, yeah, it's possible that up to that many again died. But it's a mystery. Mystery is when they either kept records and destroyed them or decided they weren't going to keep records, so to keep you guessing. About 45 plus distinct ethnic groups, and the list that's going to follow here is basically the 10 to 15 most prominent according to slaver records. So the Bakongo of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola, the Mande of Upper Guinea. So for example, when Steven Spielberg's movie, the Amistad, Senku was Mande. The Gibe speakers of Togo, the Aja, the Mina, Ewe, and Fon. The Khan of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. The Wolof of Senegal and the Gambia. The Igbo of southeastern Nigeria, who actually define themselves, and genetic evidence backs this up. They say, we are the Jews that were with Moses that decided not to wander around in the desert. We just went farther south into Africa. That's who we are. We ain't wandering. We going that way. The Mbundu of Angola, the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria, the Shamba of Cameroon, the Makua of Mozambique. So, even assuming 106 million in 1750, growing to a high of 133 million in 1900s, when the slave trade officially ended. So notice the slave trade is continuing into the Americas into the 20th century. Even though it officially ended for the British in 1807, and the Civil War theoretically ended it as well. Not so much. Right? And now, 3/4 of a billion people in Africa now. So, a max of 24 million involved during in the years of the slave trade. That means roughly 1 in 5 Africans were involved in the slave trade, either killed or shipped to America. So in other words, 4/5 of them, 80% of them, were left. So Africa still had a viable and vital population, but still subject to assault and exploitation, as we shall see. So slavery has returned to America, where slaves are coming, are basically people are being enslaved in all these countries, but in alphabetical order. And the types of slavery that we're talking about, by definition: bribe buying, slave labor, debt bondage, human trafficking, being a peonage, penal labor, which is one of the larger forms in the United States, sex slavery, sweatshop, and wage slavery. So in the slave trade to the Civil War, once the war is over, in addition to rebuilding or original creation of an African American identity, we're monolingual but multicultural. We're converted to Christian, but an activist liberation theology focused on community organizing and uplift. So others are also practicing other Abrahamic religions or not, either as a protest or not. And then at the end of the Civil War, the United States is now free to attack the Indian nations after having unified itself. And we're involved in that. So the Civil War is not about necessarily creating a new and just America. It did nothing to eliminate white supremacy or sexism or any other isms that we've been studying. The Indian nations, besides occupying land, represent a visible cultural threat to the growing United States, which relied heavily on maintaining inequalities, and still does. And the Indian nations were an obvious, kind of glaring, oh, there's another way of living here. So the Indian nations thrived without taxes, without real estate, without racial or gender prejudice, and were independent of the need for trading with the United States, largely until we started focusing on them in terms of getting land and military incursions to do that. So such trade, when it existed, proved to be an equal at best trading in goods rather than cultural technologies, such as how do you unite people across differences in a democracy. Natives were practicing that. The founding fathers were not really into that. So if you ever heard the Bob Marley song Buffalo Soldiers, to the degree that he's referring to that. So this is out of this particular website, AfroMexicans. So one of the things when I first was putting the class together and finding that there are 130 million what we would call black people in Latin America, which is more than there are in America. Right? So how do they fit in the societies that they were in? So from this website, the point that must be made here is the fact that the black population in the early colony, that is Mexico, was far larger than that of the Spanish. In 1570, we see that the black population is about 3 times that of the Spanish. In 1646, it is about 2.5 times as large. In 1742, blacks still outnumber the Spanish. It is not until 1810 that Spaniards are more numerous. So here you have a society in which it's mostly minority. So not just Africans, but also Africans mixing with natives as well as with Europeans too. So Afro-Mexicans, both slave and free, participated in various kinds of labor in Mexico. They worked in the silver mines, the majority, and a large number worked in urban centers as domestic workers, because having a black servant apparently was a status symbol. And in urban centers, both blacks, both slave and free, worked as artisans, peddlers, and craftsmen. So part of what was also happening in the United States is that slave labor, particularly where they were artisans in Africa, could produce iron work and works of art and sculpture, etc. And then, that could be sold, and they could, may or may not have gotten compensated for it depending on the master. So Africans were also deployed to rural coastal areas such as Veracruz or the Gulf of Mexico, where they are now in the states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, and on the Pacific coast. So one of the first places besides Mexico having the first black president and also freeing the slaves is also one of the first places that had, for example, Martin Luther King School named after it. Not a King holiday, though. So, blacks worked, on that last paragraph, blacks worked mainly as ranchers and cowboys. Well, that's our word for it. They called them vaqueros. So this is where that Western tradition. Livestock was a primary economic activity in that region during the colonial period, and Mexicans were found throughout the country. Afro-Mexicans were found throughout the country, not only in coast, but where their descendants live today, but other places. So, Buffalo Soldiers. This is a group of Seminoles. So that is a photograph taken in 1889. Buffalo Soldier Scouts, including the then employed retired members of the Seminole Black Indian Nation, quote unquote, a large number of whom worked for the U.S. Army after earlier being employed in the Mexican Army. So, in the Mexican Army, yes. So, remember who freed slaves first? We had a black president first, who was the Mexican equivalent of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So even though Guerrero wasn't the first president, he was the first president to basically codify into law freeing slaves and designing the flag. So that kind of makes him basically like a George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. He himself was a slave, and he actually freed slaves and promoted some sort of equality, even though he got assassinated. We'll give him the props for at least the attempt. So, Africans would escape into Indian country. North to Canada, west into the plains and into the Oregon Territory, and south into Mexico, as well as Florida. The Seminoles originally came from Florida, where they are a branch of the Creek Nation, and they were distinguished from other Creeks in their acceptance of their greater acceptance of runaway African slaves who toiled in the former British colonies that became the U.S. So acceptance and also willingness to fight alongside and against first the Spanish in Florida and then the British in Florida. And when they lost to the British, that's when they started moving across into Mexico, fighting for the Mexican army. So Mexico was a haven of slavery, just like Canada was. If you were closer than trying to make the Underground Railroad trek up to Canada, you could go south. You could also find safe harbor as well. So one of the reasons why the British opposed Africans and Indians getting together was the examples in Jamaica, the Maroons, as well as Florida, and of course the founding fathers of Oregon, who were, like Thurston, who knew this history. This is why they wanted to ban black people, because they figured the few black people that are here could easily organize the Indians if the Indians were into that. So again, there was that historical precedent. So the initial blacks within the Seminole villages were bound to work for the Seminoles in a relationship that is described as slavery without whips, chains, and with right of the bondspeople to farm their own land. One of the things that both the American whites and the British commented about this practice. So for example, the Cherokees, when they said we had slaves, they said we actually used blacks as translators to go between the tribe and negotiate with whites. But they weren't in chains and we didn't whip them, and basically the British had commented, wait, these slaves are dressed better than the chief and they can marry the chief's daughter? What kind of slavery is that? They're not treating them correctly. These Indians don't know how to have slaves. Whips and chains, that's the way. Right? So by the time of the Second Seminole War, which is the United States against the Seminoles, they were largely a mixed race. Seminoles were a largely mixed race nation in which those of African heritage took many important decision-making positions, including war chiefs and negotiators and the like. So, Dembo Factor, was one of the black Seminoles who fought in that war, the Seminole War, and in the photo, he's the elderly gentleman with the white beard. In this picture taken in 1889. Now, as we'll study in next term, the Buffalo Soldiers fought in a number of campaigns, including the whole Teddy Roosevelt adventure with San Juan Hill, where they actually took the hill themselves militarily and secured it. And then Teddy Roosevelt rode up to the top of the hill for the cameras of the press. So, that war, they lost the war and they reluctantly agreed to leave Florida and settled in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. That's their version of the Trail of Tears. During the 1840s, they were harassed by other Indian nations who considered the Seminoles to be blacks and subject to capture and sale to whites. So there are some Indian tribes that did that. Same thing happened with the Wampanoags after the first Thanksgiving, as well as the Pequots. May or may not have mentioned this, but the Pequots are probably the most prominent black Indian nation, and they own the third largest casino on the planet in Connecticut, Mystic River. So around 1850, the Seminoles began exploring the Mexico-Texas border with the hope of resettling in Mexico, where slavery had been abolished by Vicente Guerrero. The first efforts of them to resettle were unsuccessful. The Mexican-Texas border was basically controlled by the Comanches, which was opposed to all the outsiders, and they were basically considering the blacks to be outsiders. Seminoles developed means of fighting off the Comanches, and settlements were created in the Mexican state of Coahuila. In 1856, Comonfort, the president of Mexico, hired Seminole fighters to protect Coahuila and other border areas from Comanche and also from the raids by white outlaws from the United States, who could have been possibly acting in concert with the government of the United States, but hey. So after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, many Seminoles returned to the U.S., where their Indian fighting abilities were acknowledged, and they became soldiers in the U.S. Army, because now the Army was basically focusing on, shall we say, what's their word for it, pacifying the Indian nations. The Indians, natives, gave them the name Buffalo Soldiers because the hair, matted African hair, resembled the matted hair of buffaloes. Veterans of the Civil War and other non-Seminole African Americans were also in Indian country, were also fighting Indians using an army units called Buffalo Soldiers, because the army was segregated still. Black Seminoles continued to live along the Rio Grande, crossing the border between Mexico and the United States and eventually Texas. Notable Mexican Seminole town in Coahuila is named Nacimiento de los Negros. So, jumping to Asante, where basically is describing a 150-year African-European war. And quoting him, the way to view the engagement between Africa and Europe from 1807, the date Britain banned the slave trade, to 1957, that is the date the Gold Coast became independent and chose the name of the ancient empire of Ghana, is a long and bitter continental war. A brutal war fought between two continents over the material wealth of one of them. Africa had not declared war on Europe, but Europe had declared war on Africa. Now remember, in the Romans' time, and this is basically one of the, besides the time of the Crusades, in the Romans' time there was no united Europe. So this is really the first time in this time period after the Dark Ages, or what Asante refers to as the White Ages or whatever, that this is the first time that there was a united Europe able to project force in the time period that he's talking about between 1492, the period of discovery, until he's saying 1957. It's not a war fought on conventional terms, with standing armies respecting each other. For example, the European mode of battle, opposing sides stand to each other and shoot till the last man is standing, and the winning side has the most guys standing. On the European side, they use intrigue, guile, avarice, betrayal, massacres. The African responded to that. Guerrilla tactics, sabotage, non-cooperation with settlers, destruction of crops and property. So it's basically, guerrilla warfare is basically, since you don't necessarily have standing armies, you have to assemble who's available to fight and fight in the tactics that fit the land. Between 1492 and 1885, Europe's continental power and reach were unchallenged by any other area of the world. Hundreds of tons of gold and other metals and minerals were taken out of the Americas to enrich Europe. There has been an estimate, particularly in terms of looking at what the gold that the Spanish took, gold and silver that the Spanish took, it was sufficient to actually build a physical bridge between the Americas and Europe. In the beginning, the 19th century, Britain stood alone in Europe as the master of the seas and the largest slave-running country in the world. The number of ships involved in the slave trade, for example, in Liverpool, home of the Beatles, had 60% of all slave ships. So while Africans made up the majority of slaves, the English also ethnically cleansed, of course, Ireland and Scotland, and sent many of those people into slavery in the Americas and West Indies. So African disunity made conquest simpler. There are military powers in Africa, capable of feeding the now united Europe, especially with weaponry. Basically, the tactical advantage, according to Asante and others, that Europeans had was fleets of ships. Since there was no Egypt, no Carthage, with their own fleets of ships, there's nobody to meet them on the high seas to stop them. Also, even though there were some people that had guns and weaponry, not everyone did. So there was no United States of Africa, or not even a concept of doing that until the 20th century. So the only people capable of doing it, the Songhai Empire, successor to the Ghana and Malian empires, it essentially disintegrated a little over a century after Columbus made his discovery. So that means essentially nobody to stop the Europeans in a united front. So, continent lay in disarray, ripe for the plucking, which, here's the plucking. The Berlin Conference. So, meeting at the residence of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1884. Foreign ministers of 14 European powers and the United States established ground rules for the future exploitation of, and this is where we have one of the first reference to, the Dark Continent. So Africans, of course, were not invited to this or made privy to the decisions that were made here at the Berlin Conference. So this photo comes from the book of Horizon History of Africa, American Heritage Publishing. So the Berlin Conference.